wonderful to get the views on the ground of someone who's really in that day to day. So I'm really going to lean on you throughout this whole session. I'd love to hear some of your stories. The first thing I want to check in with the audience is, what sort of escalation moments are you seeing at work right now? We know that we're in a sort of an interesting time, sort of post-COVID, a lot of hybrid work. We know that some recent research has shown that the emotional intelligence of the human race globally seems to be going down every year on year for the last 4 years. What are some of the stuff that you're seeing out there in the world, guys? And Mark, I'd love to hear from you as well. What are some of the stuff that you see in your role and you have seen over the years?
Yeah, so probably for us, a lot of our escalations are externally because of the nature of our work as a regulatory body. Safety, sometimes we can be seen as a bit of a threat to people in relation to, costing them money or stopping their work and that sort of stuff. That's not the intention at all. Our main goal is keep people safe and make sure they go home the same way they came to work in. But a lot of the escalations we see are primarily from situations we've gone in where there may be, say, a person working at a height. We need to stop them working at a height to make sure they're safe. But then their perception of us is that we're only there to make their job harder and that sort of stuff. So, internally, we're lucky. We've got a very tight-knit team, so we don't have many issues with escalations internally, but definitely on our initial interactions, and that's where it's important for us to manage that right from the start before things actually do escalate out of control. So.
Yeah, interesting. So much in what you said, and it's reflected in the chat as well about, people are saying everything from like an inability to collaborate, we just can't work together, to sort of passive aggressive behaviors, incivility, people having less empathy. We're going to explore the brain and why does our brain respond in that way? What's actually happening? Right, we're seeing a lot of polarized views, Jane, right? Actually, there seems to be this narrative that people are just getting further and further away from each other, and we're taking these sort of opposite stances on big social issues at the moment, like general incivility, right, speaking horribly to others, right, hierarchy, right, toxic masculinity stuff is coming up, lack of trust, goodwill. So really seeing some of the worst sides of human behavior. This is really interesting here. Trauma influenced impacts following different customer, right? So we're looking at situations like where people are becoming much more aware of the effect that trauma has had on people, conditioning. There's a lot more talk around mental health at work. And so this whole emotional side, which I guess the conventional wisdom for a long time was, we want to keep emotions out of work. Now at the moment, sort of emotions are coming back into work, but it's really about how do we handle them in a really good way and what's appropriate. I think that's fascinating. You can really see, even from the registrations and the amount of registrations on this webinar, the amount of people who are working through stuff like this right now. Yeah, huge, right? Bullying and harassment, so much. Okay, well, let's get into this then, and let's have a little bit look about what we actually are talking about when it comes to de-escalation. So de-escalation is really just this idea of how do we reduce those strong emotions or tensions or aggressions to a manageable or productive state. And the reason that this is so important is because my saying around this is that strong emotion makes you stupid, right? It's just a fact of the brain, right? And so the reason that is because when we look at how our brain is structured, we've got this old primitive part of our brain called the limbic system, or the kind of like the security officer, right? The security guard of the brain. Its job is to keep us alive. Now, 95% of our decisions and actions are made unconsciously, and they're mediated by these old structures, right? So they have very limited and kind of black or white powers when it comes to keeping us alive. And so when you see the security officer get really agitated when they're threatened, you'll get a couple of different things. The first thing to happen is that people's thinking becomes very polarized, right? It's either black or white. It's either they're with me or against me. I'm either in or I'm out. Anytime you see binary decision making like that, you know somebody is escalated. The other thing you see is that our imagination gets hijacked. Interesting, pop it in the chat or give me a thumbs up if you've ever lain in bed at night just worrying in a loop, not getting to any solutions, just constantly running through the problem, right? That's when the limbic system can hijack the higher part of the brain. It takes your imagination ransom, and it seems like it's so hard, like a hamster on a wheel. And another thing that has been popularized quite a bit is when threat is very strong, we get kind of the fight, flight, or freeze response, right? And so there's some really interesting science and research being done around this that dives into this and looks at how these responses actually show up. Some of the new stuff coming up here is that Types of freeze response or types of flight responses include pleasing and appeasing other people, collapsing and submitting to other people. All of these are sort of heroic attempts from the security officer to keep us alive. And so the other side of the brain that's really involved in this is the prefrontal cortex, right? It's like the executive part of the brain. And so this is the part of the brain that houses all of the things that make us very human, right? Our ability to control ourselves, regulate. Language is housed up here in the left neocortex. Our ability to see the big picture is one of the areas that this really looks at, to do logical thinking. And so obviously, as soon as the first thing that goes out the window whenever we get agitated are all the things that the prefrontal cortex does. And that's because the security officer sends up inhibitory signals and actually shuts down that part of the brain. And so we say as threat increases, all these great things like self-control, collaboration, intelligent reasoning, they decrease. It's like a seesaw, right? It's like you have the perfect comeback to that argument that night in the shower rather than in the moment when you had it, because you just couldn't get access to that part of your brain. And there's a bit of a reinforcing cycle here, because as we start to get threatened, right, the stress response come up, we get physiologically aroused, our brain starts to shut down. So there's the cognitive impact. So we're not thinking as clearly. And we sort of say things like, oh, I just wasn't myself then. I'm sorry I said that. I didn't really mean that. And we have decreased self-regulation. And if we do something, we make a decision or we do an action that we later regret, that we never would do if we were actually calm. And then again, that causes more threat and then more threat and more stress response. And so if we're not careful, this can kind of continue to escalate. Right? I'd love to hear, Mark, from you, when you get onto these situations in sight and you see this reinforcing cycle, how do things tend to escalate this kind of over and back?
What quite often happens with us, I suppose, is that if we don't sort of either de-escalate it or take control of it, we sort of lose control of the situation. It's hard to get control back of it. So a lot of the time, and also I suppose in the other person too, if we're not trying to de-escalate them, the same cycle happens with them, and then we actually had a situation yesterday where there was a bit of a loss of control there, sort of thing, and it ended up with the issue not being resolved. We've got to go back and deal with it again now. So yeah, it's pretty important for us to like I tell our inspectors, is just take that step back first and foremost. Let them do what they've got to do. That allows you time to think and like you're saying, engage that frontal lobe of your brain, and not get stuck in that limbic state.
Yeah, it's fascinating. There's this, and everyone on this call, I'm guaranteed, will be able to resonate with this. There's a moment in any escalation where somebody pushes, and you can either push back or you can sort of allow them to come forward and actually catch them a little bit and start to de-escalate. And so what our instinct always wants to do is actually push back. It's that our first response is to go on the defensive, right? And the best form of defense is attack. Right? And so we'll often see that. This is one of the areas where our instinct can lead us awry. And one of the challenges here is that when someone else is behaving badly or someone else is escalated, our unconscious, right, this limbic part of our brain and our nervous system, which is about 500 million years old, senses this on a deep level, even if they're trying to suppress it, and it can be contagious, right? So as soon as you start to go into that situation, you can feel it. Right? And so that's, Mark, what you're saying about you go onto site and you can feel a bit of tension or someone is escalated, like you kind of know it in your bones. It's quite interesting. We are very, very subtly able to do that. And so the first thing that we recommend, particularly for strong threats, and this is the first little skill I'm going to teach and I'm going to recommend, is that we take control of our nervous system and the deeper parts of our brain. And so the best tool for doing this is a parasympathetic breathing, right? This is actually, and parasympathetic just simply means that it's the relaxation response of our nervous system. Sympathetic is the opposite, which is kind of like the hype up response. So whenever we want to actually run or do anything like that, our sympathetic nervous system starts to get up and we start to get agitated. This is connected to like really strong, sharp in-breaths. And so if we actually think about what's the first thing we do when we sit down on a chair, we just let out a sigh, right? Everyone always does it. You sit down, you just go, ah, right? And that's just the parasympathetic relaxation response. So the key here is that you want to make your out breath about 50% longer than your in breath. So I'm actually going to do this with people now on screen, right? And so when you're at home, no one can see you, I promise, right? If you're in an office, you can just close your eyes, you can have a bit of a moment. We're just going to do 3, right? I'm actually going to count you, and what's useful here is to put your hands just below your belly button in your diaphragm and try and breathe in there. So breathing in through your nose and out through your nose if you can, but if you want to breathe out through pursed lips, that can really work as well. And so you're going to meet me on the out breath. So empty your lungs and I'm going to count you in. Right, so we're going to count in. So breathing in, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now out, nice and slow. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. One more in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. And now out really slow for 11. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. One more in. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. Now big last one out. 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11. Now, I'd love to just hear from people in the chat, what did they start to notice about that? Even just doing 3 breaths, right? And you want to do is up to 5 minutes of this. It can really be the best way, but please pop that in. And Mark, I know we've actually gone in and we've taught this to different people in your organization. What has been sort of your response to this piece and understanding a bit about the breath? I know you've used it yourself as well.
Probably the good thing is it actually takes your mind, I suppose it takes that racing mind away as well and focuses your efforts on that breath. So it sort of gives you a bit more of a clear mind, which is probably the biggest thing, which I suppose probably helps to revert your thinking back to the front part of that brain.
Yeah, absolutely, right. So you're doing 2 things here. One, you're being mindful. You're actually just paying attention to the present moment right away. And you're also giving yourself a relaxation response in the nervous system. Right. And so what's fascinating now, people are talking about their shoulders drop, their heart rate slow, has a calming effect. Right. And someone even said it's quite hard to go out for that long. And so if you need to shorten it and do, let's say, in for 5, out for 8, all it matters is that your out breath is 50% longer than your in breath. Right. So this is something that you can use at any time. And, Julie, your question, can this become a crutch? I think it could potentially become a crutch if you're not actually dealing with any of the problems in your life. But what this does is it allows you to get into a calm state so you can then take action and take measured action, right? So obviously with any sort of conflict, you want to move towards resolution, right? But this is the first step. You have got to get yourself into a place where it's actually calm. Now, so that's the first little thing. Because at the end of the day, when we think about where we want to move to in the corporate world and kind of in our lives, is we've kept emotions out of the picture for a long time, right? If a lot of people growing up in our families, growing up with our friends, emotion is kind of like this scary, bad word, right? It's like an icky kind of something to be avoided. And so what we actually want to do is recognize it and address it in a good way. It's like when you have a bit of a challenge with a friend or a loved one, and like it just plays on your mind and plays on your mind till you actually just front up and actually have that conversation. So recognizing and addressing it in work is super, super key. So the 3 habits that we have in our CALM solution, right? And if you're interested in our solution called CALM around de-escalating this stuff, just pop CALM in the chat and we'll be able to reach out to you as well. And so we have label threat intensity. We have interpret the source of the conflict, because if you don't understand what the true source is, you can never get to the outcome, and then diffuse that situation. So the first thing we're going to actually look at is label, right? And so this is some research by a researcher called Dean Mobbs, which really he started to look at and notice that threat is not just uniform, it exists on many different levels, right? And so he came up with this interesting classification of threat, which essentially was level 1, level 2, and level 3. And this has got to do with proximity of threat. So how close is the threat to you, and then how escalated are you? So this level 1 threat is sort of like there's a vague future threat, like, a looming deadline, but it's not that serious, or, there's an economic downturn, but it hasn't really affected you yet. And so you can actually be quite alert here, but not alarmed, but quite productive, actually. This can be kind of like a eustress, like a positive stress. The second one now is then about being highly alert and somewhat alarmed. This is much less productive. This is when the threat is sort of coming close to you. You've got a big presentation that's in a couple of hours and you don't feel fully prepared, right? You might find yourself struggling to sleep sometimes, maybe a little bit at night, a bit of anxiousness, nervousness, a little bit of dry mouth, something like that. Then level 3 is like threat is actually upon me, right? I'm in a natural disaster. I'm in a medical emergency, right? And so the way you respond based on these levels of threats is very different. But in order to be able to respond well, we need to actually know what level of threat we're in. And so these are the 3 levels. Marcus, anything you'd like to say on anything coming up for you so far, or any thoughts, insights you've had?
Yeah, when we first learnt this one, we sort of realized that some of our team are actually in a 2 or 3 before they even actually get into the actual situation they're going to. And some of that's just by virtue of a perception of what's going to happen. So this is sort of important also, not only for managing yourself, but I think for managing your processes and procedures to let people know what they're about to walk into isn't as bad as what they're thinking, sort of thing. So yeah, it's definitely an interesting one.
Yeah, for sure. Right. And just knowing that if I'm sort of, even if I'm not in like a huge natural disaster, or I'm not in a really tough situation, our response could be at a level 3, right? We see a lot of times even the fear of going into a situation can create a response, because as far as the brain is concerned, fear that's imagined and events that are real are actually the same. And so I'd love to hear from people in the chat. What level would you say you are at kind of on a weekly basis as you go into work, right? Where do you see yourself? Are you 1, 2, 3? Where are you at right now, given what's going on in your life, right? Can be interesting just to reflect. Yeah, like that. A lot of people at 2, some at 3. People try to maintain a 1. Yeah, 1 can be good. Sometimes we don't even want to be at a 0, because at a 0 we can be a little bit passive. So it's interesting to reflect. Yeah, nice. Flowing play. Yeah, we're going up and down here. So yellow at some stages, red, then back to green. Hopefully we all go back to green. Now, what's interesting when we think about this whole piece about keeping emotions out of work is that particularly I've noticed in the countries I've been in Ireland, I've been in America, Canada, I've lived in Australia. We have this very Western mindset around emotion. And there are 2 main ways that we tend to default to dealing with it. The first one is actually this culture of suppression, right? This is just bottle it down, keep it inside, don't talk about it, just deal with it yourself, process it yourself. And so when you're asked about this, people think that this is a good idea, but actually when we look at it, it doesn't work, because over time, chronically suppressing emotions doesn't actually deal with the emotion, but it can actually make us sick, both physically and mentally. And also people know when you're suppressing your emotions, so it's contagious, right? It escalates, right? You can't do it very well. It doesn't actually deal with the emotion. Then on the other side, when you express, right, expression can be good in some instances, like having a good cry can be a great release for sadness. But often expression can lead to just more expression, right? So you imagine, Mark, someone on site who's constantly flying off the handle with anger, and that's the way they motivate people, or that's the way they get what they want or get things done. That expression of that anger is actually destructive for the rest of the group. Or if someone's extremely expressive about a lot of fear and worry, and they're the person in the office who's always talking about the downside and the negative and how hard things is, and how bad head office are, and it's complain and complain and complain, it really brings people down and creates this level of threat that's not conducive to doing great work. And so what we need to kind of track a middle road between that is a couple of skills from the neuroscience. So the first one that I'm going to share is a skill called labeling, right? And labeling is all about using language to represent your emotional response. Because remember, what's happening is that your limbic system is getting agitated, and it's got no words, it's all about emotion and feelings. and it's shutting down the higher part of your brain where language exists. And so when we actually label the feeling, right, we actually put feeling words around it. We say, I'm frustrated, I'm overwhelmed, I'm shocked, I'm confused. We're forcing the higher part of our brain to come on. Right? There's a part of our brain called the ventrolateral prefrontal cortex, which is called the brain's braking system. And what that does is it allows us to just down-regulate the limbic system, because the same way that the limbic system has signals going up to the prefrontal cortex, the prefrontal cortex can also, it also has pathways going down and can regulate. And that's what we want to do here. And so I'd love to just hear from people in the chat, right? Let's say you're in this situation, right? You start a new project with someone that you have a history of disagreements, you secretly don't like them. And in the first meeting, they're just going on with the same behaviors and attitude that always grates on you. What level of threat would you be at? And what emotion do you think you'd need to label in that case? And Mark, I'd love to hear from you. What are some of the things that come up for you in some of those harder moments? What are the things that you really need to keep a handle on?
I think for us, yeah, like I said before, sometimes our guys are walking into a situation where they've got a history of bad interactions in that sort of situation. So they're walking into the two or three. So I suppose there's any number of I suppose emotions they might label with that one. And sometimes it helps for us in management side of things to try and, again, we're still getting better at labeling, I suppose, because it's not a natural thing for us, particularly in construction. But trying to sort of call that out before they go into the situation. Sometimes it eases it a bit because there's a lack of control, those sorts of things. So sometimes there's uncertainty there, sometimes there's frustration, those sorts of things. So we try and sort of, if we can, sort of call it out before they go into the situation to try and manage that.
Yeah, it's fascinating. I mean, it's interesting when you see the commonalities and you look at people in the chat. A lot of people talking about frustration, right, and annoyance as one way. And we what we typically see is that there are two primary sort of base emotions that tend to come out. And it sort of depends on whether you're in a fight or a flight type of a mode. So our brain is often either going towards something or it's going away from something. And so when we're going towards something, we experience these emotions like anger, frustration. These are toward response emotions. And then when we think about trying to avoid something, and we see this in the chat, right? People are saying that there's anxious, right? Anxiety, that's an avoidance emotion, and that's a subset of fear. So typically we have anger and we have fear, right? And often what we see, and I've done a lot of work in psychotherapy, and that's my background, is that underneath those two primary emotions, or those two sort of primary emotions, there's an even deeper emotion, which tends to be sadness or grief. And what's really fascinating about this is that often the anger or the fear is a response that sits on top of the sadness. So I'll give you an example in that I've worked with a lot of people who had a lot of anger towards their parents for the way that they were treated and the way that they were judged. And so they had all this repressed anger that wasn't actually safe enough. It wasn't safe enough for them growing up to be able to express the anger. And then underneath that anger, they have this sub level of sadness because of the rejection that they felt from their parents. And the anger is a response to that rejection, like, and it's a way of coping, right? And, or the anxiety is a response to that rejection, and another, it's a way of getting yourself out of the situation. And so one of the golden rules to remember about some of our unconscious mind is that it will always prioritize our survival. So it'll use whatever means that it actually can. And so really thinking about, depending on the type of person you are and the situations you've had, you might tend towards having more sort of anger or go towards responses whenever you're threatened. And other people might tend towards more anxious and kind of fear and avoidance responses whenever they're threatened. Right. And so sometimes it can be more complex than that. And obviously each person's case is nuanced, but it's just an interesting pattern that's come out in psychology for a while. And you might start to notice yourself as well that in certain situations, around certain people, you might tend towards those avoidance emotions, or in other cases, you might tend towards those kind of go towards and anger responses, which is really interesting. I'm seeing a lot of people here saying that there were twos and threes. Yeah, uncertainty, annoyance. I'm just gonna answer that question. When we label emotion, do we call it out? So I'm interpreting that as saying, do we actually say it out loud? I think you can say it out loud to yourself. Sometimes I use this if I'm on my own, and I actually put language around it and I speak it to myself, or I'll journal it to myself. Right? Journaling again is a great tool because it activates the higher part of our brain. Because if you can put language around something, you've had to bring that part of the brain online. But if I'm with other people, I'll say it inside my own head, right? I'll say it in the voice of my own head. Yeah, interesting. There's an interesting question there about power differences impact on the threat intensity. What you will actually find a lot is that power in the environment suppresses a lot of anger responses for people. And so what we've learned often, and this is something that's in all animals, is that in order for us to go towards something, we need to assess the risk in the environment. And so as we're assessing the risk in the environment, we need to be able to make a judgment and say, is it safe to go towards this thing that I want? So let's say it's food in a clearing, right? Is it safe for me to go towards this food in response? And so then if it is safe, I'll go towards, but if there's any risk, I'll just clasp down on that go towards response. And so what you see is that in situations where there's power differential, or there you might be around people who, if you're around your parents or if you're around people who you really respect, it will contain a lot of your worst impulses. And then when you're around people where there is no risk, that stuff can come out a little bit more. So this is like the classic bully situation where they're nice as pie to any of the teachers, but then as soon as the teachers are not around, those sort of impulses start to come out. So there's that also an interesting piece in there. Mark, is there anything else coming up for you on this before we move on around this whole area?
No, I think are you going to be getting on to labeling someone else's emotions as well after this?
Absolutely, yeah.
Okay, yep, I'll leave that, yeah.
Yeah, great, thank you. So next thing here we have is interpret, right? And so this is one of the areas that is actually most challenging, because until we learn a few primary things about how the brain works, we tend to not be very accurate at interpreting what the source of the problem is for people and why we're fighting with people. And so the first thing to mention on this is that situational awareness is critical. And what situational awareness means is that depending on what's happening around us, that dictates how much spare capacity we have and how likely we are for stressors in our environment to actually cause an escalation. So you will have noticed that at certain times it's like you're untouchable. It's like you're on holiday, or you're in a good mood because something good is happening in your life. All these little things, they just brush off you, right? You don't mind, you're forgiving, you're kind. You can really have a lot of spare capacity, right? So we don't live or work in vacuums, right? So the context that we're in, the culture we're in, the country we're in, all of this affects how likely we are to escalate, and also other people, how likely we are to escalate. The next thing to think about is the environment, right? And so when we think about environment, this is about, upcoming deadlines, right? Kind of the capacity that we're at, how busy we've been in work. Mark, it's kind of like when you're on site and suddenly there's a concrete pour that's been scheduled for 10 a.m. and suddenly we used to call it, when I worked on site, we used to call it concrete fever, right? People would start to lose their minds because there was a pour coming. And as soon as you start to pour that concrete, it's going to set, right, in an hour or 2 hours or whatever it is, and you need to get it down, right? And so this creates this huge feeling of threat in people, right? So this is deadline stuff coming up, any sort of threat. And then the next thing to really look at is these non-verbal cues, right? So really thinking about what am I seeing in people's bodies? Like, where are their eyes looking? What's their body language saying, right? And we're usually pretty good at picking this up on a sort of a feeling level. So whenever you're trying to interpret conflict, you're thinking about, okay, what's the context we're in? What's happening in the environment? Like, what's the vibe? What are some of the events? What has this person been through? And then what am I actually seeing from them, right? Are they looking at the ground? Are they looking me in the eyes? Are they smiling? Are they subdued? And a lot of the time, our instincts will do a lot of this sensing for us, right? Particularly if we grew up in environments where there was a little bit of threat. Sometimes we can be hypersensitive to this stuff. Other people can just not notice this at all. But so we can really teach ourselves to look at the situation. And then the next thing that we're looking at is, what are the psychological needs that are sponsoring this escalation? Right? And this is probably the most critical piece when it comes to interpreting the source of the conflict. Because if you do not accurately know what need it is that's not met, or what bunch of needs, you can never get to a solution. This is the biggest mistake that I see people make. They try and solve the problem by giving advice and giving solutions rather than dealing with the main problem, which is the unmet need from the person. Right. And so our 5 needs are status, certainty, autonomy, relatedness, and fairness. And so when you think about status, right, and Mark, I might bring you in here, status sponsors so many of the fights that we have, right? This feeling of less than or better than others. Do the people respect me? And how many times have you got into a fight with someone because you felt like they didn't respect you? How does that play out, Mark, in your world?
Yeah, it happens a lot because there's this that like I think someone in the chat mentioned before, there's this power imbalance, I suppose, in a way, and then people do feel that threat of their status, and I suppose it plays just as much of a big role for us recognizing when our own status is threatened and making sure we act appropriately, as to when we get a response from someone and that we might feel that their status has been affected. Because, and again, as a public servant, we're heavily regulated by a code of conduct, and we always need to be acting in a proper and appropriate way. And sometimes that means letting our own status fall off to the side and not worrying about it to ensure that a situation doesn't sort of escalate. So we need to be pretty mindful of that. And in construction, that environment status is a big thing. It's like I said, it's historically been a very male dominated industry, and as men, we've just got this inbuilt thing about status, don't we? So it's sort of, yeah, it's a big weakness if you want to hold on to it.
It is, and there's actually there's a very subtle point that you draw out here around when it comes to being a de-escalator, right? And so what's really interesting is that sometimes you have to just allow the other person to have the need, right? So to have the status in order to de-escalate. And that's actually quite an advanced self-development sort of moment for people, because even though these needs are subjective, they're finite resources, right? In a relationship, 2 people can't have all the control, right? 2 people can't have all the status. And so what you will see is that what happens is people tend to fight over these needs and push back. And so someone comes for your status, you try and defend your status, right? And so as we can see, and people are saying in the chat, is that men and women both have this need very, very strongly. Sometimes the way that they fight over it can be quite different, right? Women tend to have a lot more in terms of word battles and sort of and conversation and these sorts of things, and men can typically fight a little bit more. And so we all have these needs very, very strongly. And so then the next need that really comes up is certainty, right? Knowing what to expect. Our brain really, really wants to know, and this comes up a lot, Mark, in some of the work we've been doing, is that when people arrive on site and you've got an inspector on site, that's a very uncertain moment for people, right? They're not sure what this is going to mean for my business, what's going to happen. It's really quite a tricky one when it comes to escalation. And then finally, we've got a little bit about autonomy here. I would say that these 3 needs can be some of the quickest to escalate, right? People trying to control each other, micromanaging each other. Often what happens in relationships is that there's a battle going on around control. And so you might find that you're fighting with your partner at home because of the duties that you have in the home, or you're fighting with your kids because they won't clean their room or whatever it is. And you just think that you're fighting with them because they're unreasonable, or why can't they do these things? But until you recognize that underneath it all is a fight for autonomy, and until you can find a way forward where both people can get their need for autonomy met, you're not going to find a resolution, right? If you don't find a way forward where both people can get status, right, it's much, much easier. And Erica, that's exactly it, right? You have to learn to facilitate rather than control, right? It's really, really subtle. It's like the classic situation as a leader where you ask questions, right, to facilitate people's thinking. And that's you having your need for control met in a really nice way, but also it gives them a lot more autonomy. And so it's not a zero-sum game at all around status, where one person is more than the other. It's more about how you're getting that need for status met. So as Mark sort of outlined, he's got to the stage where when someone comes in and attacks his status, he actually maintains his status by being the one who steps back and says, look, I'm bigger than fighting that status battle. I'm going to be the one who's going to de-escalate this situation and work towards an outcome that works for both people. That is status, right? But it's a higher form of status, right? So you're getting your status from being that higher person. And then, of course, relatedness, right? That next need here about in-group or out-group. Am I part of the community or not? Relatedness is huge because it's like a tool that we use in conflict, right? We revoke relationships or we bring relationships in. So relatedness is sort of like the floor that this conflict is happening. When we don't have that rapport with people, and Mark, you could speak to this, but when you go into environments where you've worked with the person before and you have a bit of relationship, that makes that conversation, even if it's a tough one, a lot easier.
I'm sorry. Yeah, definitely. Yeah. And you know, we build to get, you know, obviously respect, and there's mutual respect there too. So it's so much easier. Whereas you've got to go, you know, all those other needs are met when you already know someone. Whereas if it's just from the start, you've sort of got to, like you said, those first three important needs, you've got to sort of cross those barriers before you even get the relatedness sort of thing. So it's a lot harder work.
It is, right? And it's funny, like when you first meet someone, that feeling of otherness, the feeling of strangeness that you have because you don't have relatedness, and you have to be much more polite and much more careful around status and autonomy and certainty as you develop that relationship. I'd love to hear from people in the chat. What are some of the scarf domains that trigger escalations in you? What are the ones that if someone steps on you, you find it very hard not to push back? I'd love to hear that. And then fairness, the last one, this is perception of fair exchange. So when people feel like we're being treated unfairly, this is one of the main reasons that people start to escalate, right? And Mark, it happens on site where people think you're playing favorites, or they think, oh, you're not going and talking to these people down the road. Like, how does fairness relate to escalations for you on site?
Yeah, it's huge. Particularly considering we've got a fair amount of discretion in what we do sometimes. And we do actually have a compliance monitoring enforcement policy that actually does, I suppose, try to lead towards more fairness, where we've got a very standard response to certain things in relation to how we escalate issues with enforcement action. But yeah, the particularly the one about why aren't you doing something across down the road, and we make sure we actually, you know, if we're looking at a housing estate, if we visit one house and do something in relation to that one house, we actually make sure our inspectors go and visit every other house to make sure there is fairness there too, because that perception of unfairness isn't a good thing. So we need to make sure everyone's being treated equally with that sort of stuff. So it's a big one, yeah.
Yeah, it's massive. I'm seeing just so many people in the chat saying how big fairness is for them, right? And fairness is interesting because you've got sort of two lenses on it. You've got, am I being treated as fair as everyone else? Or am I being treated the same as I was in the past, right? We're actually very sensitive to if someone has changed the way they're treating us, right? And in the past it was fair, or in the past it was we accepted it, and then now they've changed it. I'm also seeing a lot here around status, of course, and autonomy, right? Massive, right? And we can see that equity and fairness is absolutely a challenge, Diana, right? And there's a lot of conversation now about how do we get equity and and the difference between equity and equality, and how do we actually work out all of these things. It's quite interesting. Yeah. There we go. Erica has, Mark, she's given you a thumbs up in the chat. She said, I've always found the inspectors really good in WA, helpful and truly well listened to and very fair.
Good to hear my counterparts are doing well.
It's good to hear the reputation is good. Now, interestingly, we're quite good at seeing other people's triggers, and often we're not that good at seeing our own triggers. And so SCARF is a little bit of a two-way street, right? We need to use them to understand the threat that we may feel in a situation and how others may be feeling. Because often what you'll find is that if someone is threatened in a certain need, that's going to bring up that need for you as well. And so it'd be interesting to hear from people, what scarf domains cause the most conflict in your organization? What is the one that, when you look around in the meetings you go into on the day-to-day, when things get escalated or there's incivility, what are the ones that get in the way? Status, right? Andrea, straight in with status. It's really interesting in this virtual environment. I don't know how many people work virtually or some sort of hybrid, but there was this interesting study by, I think it's Zunin et al. 2023. The team might be able to find it, but they showed that because of the continuous poor quality communication, right, that's going on because of all the Zoom calls, we're having frequent poor quality communication, and frequent poor quality communication where people don't actually get to build relatedness and get that feeling actually erodes trust over time. Even though the amount of connection is the same, the quality goes down. And so what we're seeing is that people are a little bit more sensitive to status threats, right? Because we're all working at home and we're all flat out doing what we want to do, and people don't see what we're doing, they don't know what we're doing, so they're coming in requests here and there, and you're like, do they not know how busy I am, right? And so it can be even harder to keep that status under wraps, right? Fairness is another one. Autonomy is really bug. Yes, certainty is massive at the moment around a lot of different org changes, restructures. Certainty can be huge. Definitely working with a couple of organizations now where certainty is a massive, massive one. Thank you very much, guys, for sharing in the chat. Please keep it coming. Mark, what do you see the big ones for you?
For us, I think the big three is status, certainty, and fairness. Huge. I mean, they all actually play a role. Relatedness, we make the vast majority of inspectors are tradespeople and come from the industry, so we have a bit of relatedness there. So I think everyone's been out there and done that. So autonomy is a hard one because obviously in the role we're in, we have to do what we got to do. So there's not a lot of autonomy there for the other party, but we don't need to play on that. I suppose we can, get around that. But yeah, definitely status, certainty, and fairness. For like anyone, it's no different to whether it be us or the police or a council inspector coming to see you. Everyone feels the same way when in that sort of situation, I suppose. So we've got to be mindful of those when we're coming into a situation.
Nice, Mark. Yeah, absolutely. It's fascinating. Even just, and we're going to go into diffusing now, even just having your go-to tools for how you deal with different escalations can be really, really powerful, because one of the challenges is, as we've seen, is that when we're in the moment, the threat level can be contagious. And often when we need the calm, measured ability to see the big picture, it's furthest away from us. So what I've observed over the years and practiced myself is that you need to really practice these skills and practice being able to diffuse situations whenever things are not heating up, so that in the moment you actually have a chance. Because it really does come down to this split-second ability to be able to automatically respond in the right way. Because if our instincts are telling us to respond in a poor way, Mark, like you talked about, escalating things and fighting back around status, we need to really hone ourselves. And so one of the best things to do, and the first thing I would always recommend people do when they go into an escalation situation is, yes, I've calmed myself down, I've done some breathing, I've labeled what could be coming up for me. And then I need to go in and just really give this person a good listening to, right? And so because our first instinct is to defend, and as soon as we start to defend or go on the offensive, we escalate. The best thing you can do is actually step back, listen to what the person, where they're coming from, and summarize it back in your own words, right? Don't just paraphrase it, don't just send it back, but just take it in, summarize it back, and then label the other person's feeling really carefully, right? And so this is a really subtle skill, and it has to be in this order. And the reason it has to be in this order is because the summary back of what people are feeling justifies the emotion, right? So you say something like, wow, like, what I mean? Like, you've been on site and you've got concrete coming at 10 a.m. and now I've come in on top of you and you didn't expect me to be there. You thought I'd be here tomorrow. So of course you're frustrated. Or, wow, that seems frustrating. And they go, yeah, like, of course I'm frustrated. And you get that sort of yes, you get that nod, you get that acceptance. And so the useful language here is to soften your language and say that seems, that could be frustrating. I'm sensing confusion, because it's quite subtle. But when you say to someone, oh, so you're angry, right, with the best intentions, They go, no, I'm not angry, right? So words like angry or strong emotion words can be a trigger. Telling people how they feel can be an absolute trigger. And so the subtlety here is to summarize back, to validate, and then label very carefully and use softer language like frustration instead of anger. Right. Yeah. Calm down is a great one to say, Denise. Exactly. I think you just need to calm down. That's one way to escalate any argument that you're in. And so there's lots of ways to get this wrong, but only a few ways to really get it right. Mark, what would you say about this whole skill and how this has landed?
Yeah, and that is one we're still working our way through because it's not so natural, really, is it? It's sort of harder to. But I think, like you said, and I think people in the chat have pointed out about calling out someone's. You've got to use those words like, "Oh, that must be frustrating," or instead of saying "you seem frustrated," you sound frustrated. So using those softer words and labeling the situation and not the person's emotions is a good way of doing it, I think. So.
Yeah, absolutely. Right, and you can see it in the chat. Yeah, people are saying, "Oh, you're judging me now, right?" And this is what can happen when it goes wrong. And so one of the things here about these skills is that they actually have to be genuine, right? People can tell when you're faking it or when you're doing it just to try and sort of we say in Ireland mollycoddling. I'm not sure what that even means, but you're sort of faking it, right? And so another interesting one that someone has put in the chat is actually to own your own emotion and say that I feel this, right? This is called using I statements. So it's like, I've arrived home and I expected the kitchen to be clean and for the second day in a row, and I come back to find that there's dishes everywhere, and I feel really frustrated by that. You really want to avoid saying you statements. You did this, you made me feel frustrated, you made me feel angry, you did this to me. That is an escalation tactic right in itself, right? So, and this can be one of the hardest things, is just to own your own emotion, because at the end of the day, you are the one who owns your own emotion, right? The outside event is happening. Your emotional response is yours. And you might think that someone else has made you feel that way. But if you're very honest with yourself, you're the one feeling that way. And that's not to say that they're not out of line, but your emotion is your responsibility. So then when we take this a little bit step further and we've done a bit of listening, we can use SCARF again here to actually send reward signals depending on where these people are triggered. So if you go in and if someone is really big on status, even just listening to the person, right, like we've just practiced, that's a big status boost. Or praising them for something that they're doing well, right, giving them respect in some way. The next one is certainty, right? Being really clear on expectations, right? Talk about what you do and don't know. So like Mark, we discussed this a little bit in some of our sessions around giving people clarity on what you're actually going to check rather than leaving them in the dark. Would you like to speak about any of these?
Yeah, I think, and we can actually fulfill, like, say, a couple of these things right up front, like you said, the status thing, coming on with a smile and a handshake, introducing ourselves in a non-threatening manner, and that way, and then like straight away laying on the line exactly what we're doing while we're here, what's going to happen, and then with it, we can also touch on the fairness side of things at that point too. But yeah, we as inspectors, we can actually address a lot of these things with the very first 30 seconds of interaction, basically. So
Yeah, it's really true that the way you start off a conversation can be absolutely massive. So if you go in saying, right, I'm going to give this person a status boost, I'm going to give them some certainty, right, some placement of what's going to happen, right, some autonomy, right, giving choices on how to progress forward rather than just telling people what to do can be massive. The relatedness then is like acknowledging their feelings, discussing how you can support them, or just trying to build a human connection can be massive. And this is particularly hard now when we're in hybrid environments. Sometimes the human connection can go out of things, but relatedness is really like the oil that kind of lubricates all of our social interactions, right? When we don't have someone in our in-group, we tend to see the things that they do. Like, for example, if somebody asks us for a raise at work, if they're in your in-group, you'll go, wow, isn't it great that they're so ambitious? But if they're in your out-group, you'll say, wow, aren't they so demanding? Right? And it's like our perception of what people do has got a lot to do with whether they're in group or out group. And then fairness, right? Can we be transparent with processes, allow time for questions, deal with any escalations, any things that we have to deal? Trying to be fair in the way that we interact with people is massive. And so there are some questions in the chat about what when people just don't play, what when people just like they don't care, they don't want to go to a solution. And so when we actually do CAM, we do teach a hierarchy of conflict resolution, which starts off and talks about how you can go for a win-win, but it actually ends up in when looking at consequences. And so consequences are a part of conflict resolution, right? There's no getting away from it. If you're investing into a relationship and you're listening and you're doing all the things that you should be doing, and the person is just continuing to behave in a bad way, you do have to bring consequences in there. Right. And so, Mark, for you, is consequences are obviously a huge part. Like, how can and when can you use consequences in a really good way?
Um, I suppose it's hard with us because our consequences are obviously tied directly to our function as a regulator, sort of thing. So in a lot of circumstances, we have to do that. But in saying that, it could also come with an offer to continue working with them to help them, sort of thing. So yeah, like I said, we're pretty tied to, you know, and obviously when it comes to people's safety, there isn't any compromise. So we're pretty tied to, you know, to fulfilling our function as a regulator. We have to deal with certain circumstances, but it doesn't always have to end at us just basically here, do this and walking away. It can also involve some further interaction that might actually help them down the track, because at the end of the day, it's a win-win for both of us if they can become a better business and a safer business. So
I think it's a beautiful way to bring it home, actually, because the thing that motivates me around this stuff is that at the end of the day, you're going to be working with these people for, if not months, years, you know what I mean, and potentially decades. So, like, it's in your interest to have a relationship with them. And so, at the end of the day, the bigger picture is here. It doesn't just stop today, this one argument or this one thing. It's actually about the broader relationship over time. And it's just, no matter what's actually coming up in a relationship, if you do invest the time, if you use these skills rather than trying to be right, you're going to move the relationship into a much more positive direction. And you'll find you can work with pretty much anybody if you don't fight them on the places that they're dug in. If they're big on status and they just want all the status, let them have it. Right? If they're really big on autonomy, put your boundaries in place, but let them have their autonomy, right? And so, and if you can't handle them, then do get out, right? If there's nothing you can do, do get out. I would love to hear from people in the chat before we go. How will you build your de-escalation skills? Please pop it in the chat. What was the biggest takeaway for today? And what are some of the things that you're going to try out again? Mark, what's the big one for you?
well, for me, and I think SCARF is a huge one. I think it's something that we all tend to do sometimes naturally, but we've never really been able to put a label to it and actually understand it, sort of thing. So, and we might only do some of those things. So understanding how that all works and being able to try and build that just as part of your general interactions with people is a massive benefit, I think. But also I think for us, it can actually help to inform policies and procedures as well, to make things easier for people. So
yeah, absolutely, Mark. It's wonderful. And thank you for, just a big shout out to you, Mark, for taking the time. You know, people in the chat saying that they love your on the ground examples. I really appreciate working with you, and thank you very much for being willing to take these on, have a crack, bring this into an area where it's really needed.
no
Melody, do you
problem.
want to hand back to you for some announcements?
Yes, and thank you again, Mark. But I would like also to say thank you to Cian, because it will be his last webinar for a little while in Asia Pacific, because Mr. Cian is going to Europe for, can I say, or do you want to say it?
Sure.
He's getting married. All right. Yes, so thank you everybody for joining. If you'd like to hear more about our solutions for, you know, for yourself or for your organizations, please take part in our poll that I'm going to launch.
I've already launched it, Melody.
Yeah. Oh, awesome. That's why I love him so much. Yeah, so either for your organization or for yourself, or you can explore corporate memberships, which unlocks, you know, insiders features of NeuroLeadership Institute. And if you'd like to speak to us, an advisor, you can simply use the QR code, but I'll also put the link in the chat to make it easier. And then we will reach out to you later. Other than that, we have a webinar in 2 weeks on putting the eye into integrity, which I think will resonate a lot with everybody here who listened to that webinar. Thank you again, everybody, for joining us. It's a real pleasure to have you. And if you want to have us closer to you, well, we are launching NILES, and NILES is having NeuroLeadership Institute at your fingertips. You can ask our AI-powered bot every question, and it will be like just talking to Cian, but in digital. So that's pretty much it. Thank you very much once again, everybody, and have a bit of sunshine if you can. It's been raining a lot in Australia. And thank you for the global audience. See you in 2 weeks' time for the next episode.
Thanks, everyone. See ya.